Hello, I'm Sophie Hooper. I'm the Head of Policy and Research at IWFM. Welcome to today's episode on neurodiversity and the built environment. Workplace and facilities managers are obviously responsible for making sure that the people in the buildings they manage can do their best possible work. The last few years, we have not just seen huge changes in where people work, but our understanding of how different people function differently and engage with the world has also increased. For some time, we've had IWFM guidance on access, and for a long time, it focused on physical differences in access. But in recent years, it also increased its focus on neurocognitive profiles and how to adapt places for people with neuroatypical profiles. And the next update will include even more. Now, since October 2022, we have a new PAS, a publicly available specification that provides extensive guidance for the built environment for multiple sensory processing differences and conditions. It aims to help you manage intuitive environments which readily accommodate for different neurological profiles. And today, I have the pleasure of being joined by two experts, Jean Hewitt, who was the technical author of the PAS, and Chris Barnes. And I have the honour to also call them members of our Equity, Diversity and Inclusion panel, where they are helping us to deliver against IWFM's own equity, diversity and inclusion commitments, including for the profession. And that also covers neurodiversity. Now, I'm sure that Jean will mention it as well, but it may get lost in her accolade of achievements. Jean is also an official UK Government Disability and Access Ambassador for the built environment, and Chris has previously kindly shared his own experiences, including in a recent article for us on his own autism journey. Now, we will be taking questions after Jean's presentation, so please post your questions to the Q&A box from now on. Not in the chat function, we've reserved that for other messages. If you want to remain anonymous, then please just type Anon before your question. And please note that we should also have started closed captions. Before we start Jean's presentation, I will, however, to ask both the panel to briefly introduce themselves. Jean, can I start with you, please? You're on mute.
Sorry, it's a good start, isn't it? Hello, everyone. So I'm Jean Hewitt, and I work at Bureau Happold as an inclusive design consultant. But I also have the government role as voluntary that Sophie mentioned, and I'm a lecturer at UCL. Been working on standards for about 20 years, and input into those. But for a couple of years, I worked on the PAS standard as the technical author. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Barnes. I am Account Director at Pareto Facilities Management, which I have been for just over 5 years now. And I've been FM all my working career. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and making the time to prepare for this as well. As I mentioned, Jean is about to start her presentation. If you've got any questions popping up during her presentation, we'll get to them afterwards in our discussion. Jean, the floor is yours. Jean, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. The mute buttons at the bottom disappeared as my slides came up. So good morning again. Let's look at this. Right, so I've talked about me already, so I'll say no more on that. What I'm going to talk about now, very, very briefly, is talk about what I mean by neurodiversity, then look at the PAS 6463 structure, and then we're going to have a journey through the FM-related content examples, which I hope you'll find helpful. So neurodiversity then, what is it? It's variation neurocognitive profiles, as many of you will know. We don't come in a one-size-fits-all physically. Why would we brain-wise either? So we have these different neurological differences and variations across the whole population, and they can be genetic and normal and natural, and we should expect them to be there. We're all neurodiverse. So what this means in reality is that we may think and process information slightly differently, learn new things in different ways, communicate with others sometimes in a slightly different style. Some of us find our way from A to B in a very different fashion and have a lot of difficulties with that, and generally can experience the world, particularly the built environment, with nuances or sometimes with a lot of difficulties. So the terms that we've got in the standard then are neurodiversity, so everyone, not the whole population. Neurotypical, meaning someone not with a spiky profile, and I'll explain what that is. We have a little graph at the top right, and you can see, I hope, a dotted blue line running through it, which is completely even, which is kind of saying that is a person who probably doesn't exist, entirely identical in their ability to do everything, whether it's numerical, language, sport, art, etc., etc. Of course, no one is like that. Most of us will have this yellow line, slightly undulating things with a little bit stronger out, a little bit weaker out, perhaps, or we struggle with. When you have a spiky profile, which is most typical for a neurodivergent person or someone with a neurodivergent trait, you've got this kind of zigzagging going on. So you can have some real key strengths that are really, really very strong, and then you can have kind of a nosedive. So I am kind of probably a neurotypical, and I say probably because everybody's kind of doubting themselves these days, given the information that's coming forward. But I have a couple of deep spikes, one of which is wayfinding, which I find incredibly difficult, but almost get lost in my own house. So that's what the spikiness means. I hope that makes sense. So neurodivergent is someone who's not fitting the majority neurotypical model. We think at the moment, I would say 70%, but it might even be less than that. Maybe 60% of the population fit the neurotypical model of the yellow zigzag line, and everyone else fits outside that. So it's a considerable part of society. And then there is this term neurodegenerative, which is a progressive condition. So not one that you're born with, but can be something like dementia, Parkinson's, that causes some of those neurocognitive differences. So our brains are not in neat compartments. We do have these labels out there like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and so forth. And those labels can sometimes be helpful in getting some of the support mechanisms we want, particularly in a learning environment. But essentially, we are all really quite messy and neurodiverse, and we have a little bit of everything. So there are some people who struggle more than others, and I will come on to that and why that is. The sensory processing differences can include hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. So hyper is where you feel everything very extreme, and this can cause some sensory overload. As we know, any sort of neurocognitive overload can cause your heart rate to go up, your breathing to become laboured, it can cause high blood pressure, confusion, anxiety, and so on. So we think around 70% of those people who are diagnosed with a neurodivergent condition are believed to be hypersensitive. In the built environment, what that means is it's really difficult because you cannot filter out background noise and extreme lighting and patterns and so on, and strong smells, things like that. It is much more difficult to filter out if you're hypersensitive. If you're hyposensitive, you're undersensitive, and you may seek out additional sensory stimulation. And the PAS guidance is focusing much less on that. And the reason for that is because if someone is hyposensitive, they can usually have stimming devices, fidget jewelry, little things on their desk. They can, headphones with music, add their own stimulation. Whereas the built environment, when it's compounds, with noise and lighting and so forth, that's not something you can ever get rid of. So that's the focus really for the PAS. I have to say, many people who experience the challenge in the built environment that I'm talking about will not have a formal diagnosis for sensory process condition or difference. And I know we'll come on the conversation later about the length of time it takes to get someone diagnosed. So people could be undiagnosed and have a condition, or they might be neurotypical with spikes in one or two areas. And I found in the course of developing the PAS that there were many people on the kind of fringe that actually are affected by these things as well. And it could be, for example, migraine sufferers. Quite often it can be linked to hypersensitivity to visual noise. And people with vestibular conditions are definitely affected by both the audible noise and the visual noise. So I work a lot with the Many Air Society, and I know there's a lot of commonality, and they've given some input to the standard. So this is the standard, PAS 6463, which spells mind on the telephone keypad. Design for the mind is a term that we'd used for some time on one of the committees, so we've kept that, but we felt that we needed to add that it was, neurodiversity, so everyone understood what we were talking about. We knew for years that we needed this at such a standard, and there was a piece of research done through the BSI funding for the Helen Hamlin Society, and they interviewed a lot of people with neurodivergent and neurodegenerative conditions and got their feedback on the sort of things they struggled with in the built environment. So that was the kind of starting place. And then in 2018, we did put some general high-level recommendations into BS 8300. For those of you who do anything with accessibility will know that that's kind of our standard in the UK for looking at that. And then in 2019, we got some funding, which the sponsors for the funding were Transport for London. Bureau Hapgood sponsored my involvement for both flooring, because flooring is a very big area. It's a lot of visual noise to experience, if it's two patterns and so forth. And my client BBC Workplace as well, who had already done some quite pioneering things in their own workplace for their neurodivergent members of staff. So a PAS stands for Publicly Available Specification, which probably makes it sound much more prescriptive than it actually is. It's actually a first step towards a formal standard. It's usually produced very quickly. Typical is 9 months. I did actually take 2 years, but it was during COVID, and that made it a little bit more difficult. And also I was told to do 40 pages, and we've ended up with 183 because there was so much to say on the subject. So I'm a technical author, but I work with a steering group of experts. So although I think I've become very knowledgeable on this through that process, I certainly was not the expert at the outset, and I would hesitate to call myself that now as well. But the 6463 steering group that I worked with included many people with both lived and professional experience, which I think was really, really important. So that's what the front cover looks like. It can be applied to any mainstream environment, and it very much focuses on the design and management to reduce negative sensory experiences in the built environment. So it covers intuitive design and management of external and internal places, and our target audiences are facility and estate managers as well as designers. I've been pulling out some bits that I kind of, it really highlights how much this is about the management side of things. You can see here that primary aid of the guidance is to influence design and management and reduce this sensory or cognitive overload. We want to provide flexibility, choice and control to people. You can only do that by involving the FM team, and to offer places for recovery and respite. So you can put those in, design them, but still the FM team are going to be managing them. This guidance is meant to be beneficial for a broad spectrum of neurological sensory processing differences. We've tried to avoid a lot in the standard using labels too often. So we're not saying it's about autism or it's about ADHD and so forth, but there are some specific guidance, some hints about, well, this may affect people with this trait in this way, just to kind of illustrate it a bit more. So the content's relevant to most building type. We haven't gone into the specialist deep care provision. So this is about mainstream buildings only. However, I think some of the guidance could be applied equally, perhaps in the common areas of a dementia care home, for example, or special educational needs establishment. That's what the contents list looks like. So it typically follows the normal building route as you would experience it, or you would build it. So if you design it, you develop the brief first, and then you'd look at the layout of the site, and then how you get there, then you'd look at externals and internals and so on. Also, there's a few annexes there. I'm going to come back to the management and maintenance one because I think it's really important for FMs to perhaps dip into that a bit more. But right at the introduction, we do say how important the management role is, and how really you can design it but you've really got to manage it well as well. And I make a key point here, and I know this is always a struggle for many FMs, that they're not at the table, not around the table or in the design team from the outset. They're often not present on a new build. But I do think that they should be represented and have input into the building design. So maybe they get that from someone like IWFM if they haven't already appointed. And many of the recommendations in the PAS relate to arrangements that might require long-term monitoring and maintenance. So I really wanted to emphasize the point that the management of facilities is not to be underestimated in meeting the needs of users. So you can see here that we link to the REBA plan of work, and there's another piece of work that Sophie and I have been doing separately on that, but specifically on neurodiversity, we've put something under every stage. And I've just pulled these out because these are the key ones where we talk about identify someone on the management team here, and then we're talking about much more the management side, obviously at stages 5, 6, and 7. So I think they're good points for you to look at if you happen to have access to this standard. This standard is free, so anyone can have access. It's just a chunky read, so I think it'll help people to signpost people in this way. There's a section on facade design and shade reflection and glare, heat gain, how you orientate outside a building and sight lines and windows. I'm not expecting many FMs to potentially have much say in the design of that, but they might want to have a look at that. It's probably not the most important chapter for you though. And then section 6 is on wayfinding. So again, if you're doing a new signage system, it'd be helpful, but I think where FMs might come in is giving this advanced information and preview into a building, which really helps someone to acclimatise and prepare themselves for entering your facility. And also, if you're introducing things like technology, that would probably very often be driven by the estates team. On external spaces, we talk a lot about biophilia in a few places in the guide, and I think this connectivity with nature is a really strong point. It helps everybody's mental health and well-being, as we know, and many people with neurodivergent conditions are more likely to experience poor mental health because of the day-to-day impact of the environment and societal factors. So biophilic design is particularly helpful. And that could be either having the views out to nature or connectivity with nature, or even having images of nature on the wall or plants if you can manage them, and using and choosing very natural materials is always helpful as well. It's just, the fact that you can touch timbered a desk rather than a plastic one can be very grounding. There's lots of things to consider on the external spaces if you're managing those. Is there shelter, shade, daylight, and lighting? Because light can cause a lot of issues for people. Sightlines are helpful generally, but also that need to kind of feel like you can disengage from those around you and perhaps sit somewhere a little quieter if possible. So we look a lot at sounds and noise throughout the standard anyway. Also, how you transition between spaces, because some people have difficulty and need to acclimatise. So having a kind of transition zone can be quite helpful, or a marker that is kind of suggesting that things are changing and taking people gradually from one type of environment to another, rather than a sudden change. And giving people places to actively engage and to retreat is really, really important, because there are times, of course, when all of us want to collaborate and be social, and there are other times when we want to sit quietly. And even the choice of planting can make a difference there. So the transitions matters as much outside as it does inside, and that layout and symmetry and sense of where you are within a space is really helpful. So anything that you can do for familiarity or clarity and orientation to help people is a really useful thing to do. I think in many workplaces, if we talk about a typical office, and this standard is not just about offices, but if you were talking about an office environment, the control over giving people back control over where to sit when practicable is really, really helpful. And I think this has moved on a lot because of COVID, but with the hybrid working and more flexible working arrangements, people very often now will be booking a desk, and they have more choice than they would have done previously when they had a set position they had to work in, which may or may not have met their neuro profile needs. One of the sections that I didn't really think about at the beginning, and I hadn't really thought about it being in there, but came out and emerged over time, was this one. It's the mechanical, electrical and plumbing. And that was because of some of the feedback from the Helen Hamlin, where they were talking about the hypersensitivity to odors or chemicals and so on, and how that can cause headaches, nausea, disorientation, confusion, and fatigue. So this is something also that's been exacerbated by COVID, where many people, although some lost a sense of smell or had different senses, some people got a very hyper sense of smell now as well, to a sickening degree. So they're very, very sensitive to smells in the environment, but also a lot of people with neurodivergence are as well. So we're going to look at 3 of these sections in particular. The air conditioning one is a very small section anyway, but I want to have a look at the air quality, temperature control and the switches controls. So air quality and odours, limiting construction materials and finishes with VOCs. A lot of this would be in good practice anyway, specifying low VOC or water-based adhesive products, for example, carpets that are free of chemicals, got low nap or piles, so you can clean them better, and looking at your filtration and ventilation systems and having those periodic purges of cold air and so on. And then the cleaning regimes, including possibly a HEPA for carpets and using unscented products in toilets and bathrooms, maybe introducing plants that will help you reduce those VOCs. So I've said that bamboo palm is particularly helpful on this. And then I think it's very good practice to display some air quality readings for those people that really struggle with this. And of course, we'll know that many people at the moment have got hay fever and so on because of the hot weather. And many of the things in the PAS are like that, but they will not just help neurodivergent people, they will actually help everyone. On the temperature control, we can't have, in most situations, people just turning the heating up and down. I know it's a bane of many FMs, but the heat and humidity and the sensitivity control, it can be both. So just being aware of that and how important it is to have different spaces. Some buildings can successfully identify a cooler area as opposed to a warmer area of the floor plate. And of course, that can move around during the day with solar gain and so forth. But having something like a sensory map can be really helpful. That you can indicate perhaps with your desk booking system, this is a cooler part of the office in the mornings, but not in the afternoons or something like that. Be really helpful to someone. So some control can help, whether that's an openable window. And I know they can be problematic because not everyone will want it open. A fan or perhaps a small heater or blanket, depending what conditions are. But that zoning really does allow some choice. And I think you can then have restrictions on how much adjustment people can otherwise do, because otherwise you're going to make it better for one individual and worse for another. So we're mostly working in open plan offices or open plan environments. And then under the switches, controls and automation, we've said is that they should be intuitive and simple to use. If they're sensor operated, it should be made clear that they are, but providing advanced information on those can be really, really helpful as well. I think advanced information on everything is really good. Section 10 was acoustics and noise management, and this was the biggest cause for sensory overload. And the reason for that is when you're hypersensitive, you have less ability to filter out what you don't want to hear. So you can see some people can tolerate quite high levels of noise and still happily concentrate, whereas others really can't. It's not just loud noises as well. So people can be sensitive to continuous noises such as a hum or whir, or intermittent sounds, unexpected sounds, high volume noise, or maybe some specific frequencies. And for some people, such as misophonia, it can be very softer sounds, or even a continuous hum, a ticking clock, a dripping tap, even the sound of someone chewing can be intensely annoying, more than annoying, really, really intrusive. So we looked at acoustics and worked with our acoustics team and Ecophon, had lots of input on that. Acoustic layout and zoning does offer some choice. So I've got some smaller buildings where they've just made one floor, the quiet floor, and another floors, collaborative floors, or you might have parts of a floor. But using the right absorptive materials in the right places, carpets, finishes, etc., really, really helpful. But also choosing low noise items that you're adding in. So, for example, a low noise kettle or dishwasher, and having soft closed cupboards, all of this adds up to the noise that people can hear. We took the criteria from some other standards and we looked at the building bulletins for schools who had some good criteria in the special educational needs sections. So some of that has kind of come across. So it's not like we've done new research for this. We've looked at what's there and how we can kind of amend it slightly. We also looked at soundscape, and we found that therapeutic recorded sounds may be beneficial to some people. Some people do like music, running water, and so on. But for other people, it really has to be a silent environment. So imposing sounds on people isn't such a great idea. And then on the lighting, there was a lot on daylight, glare and shadows, and flicker. A lot of people are changing to LED for environmental reasons, but the LED can also cause flicker if it's not designed appropriately. So it's to do with driver compatibility. We also looked at illumination ratios. So, for example, that you're not going from one zone to another with a very vast difference in lighting. That could be very intrusive for someone who's hypersensitive. It's also very confusing to someone sightless, actually. Considering light pollution, such as LED street lights, for some people that will really, really disturb their sleep. Equally, adaptational lighting might be useful for some of your environments, such as if you've got shift workers or people with seasonal affective disorder or dementia, that maybe are affected by daylight or with dementia, very confused about the time of day and not kind of reading well circadian rhythm type lighting could be helpful. Generally speaking, we found that the warmer lighting was much more palatable for people who were hypersensitive. Cooler lighting obviously aids alertness, but it does disturb your sleep rhythm and so on. We found that a lot of evidence about the LEDs causing issues where they weren't designed properly, and this is an information paper by our lighting team, where they work with the National Disabilities Team for Inclusion on what we should be doing correctly, particularly in hospitals where we've got hospital lighting going in, where it's causing issues, and people with autism and other hypersensitive traits really, really struggling to even enter the building, let alone stay there for any length of time. And then we looked at surface finishes, so colours. You can have any colour you like, but obviously if you have rainbow coloured environments, that's quite stimulating visually. So what we're saying is mute the colours rather than vivid. And muting doesn't take much. We had a colour expert input on the PAS, and she said, it always sticks in my mind that if you add 5% black to any colour, it will mute it. It just takes it down that tad and makes it softer. So we're not saying you can't have specific colours. We're saying, can you, generally speaking, the main environments, can you mute them? If you want to have something really bright, maybe put it somewhere where nobody has to dwell, nobody's sitting there staring at it. It's something maybe you walk past momentarily, or you can avoid altogether. There was some information there around dementia. I don't think it's so relevant unless you're working in that type of environment, but where if you've got adjacent floor finishes, you didn't want a big LRV, light reflectance value, like visual contrast change. Some people have what we call freeze, like Parkinson's, dementia, but they can't step over it because they can't perceive what it is. But I don't think that's relevant to most of the FMs probably on this call. Lots about floor and wall patterns and what's a busy pattern. Generally speaking, I would say the biophilic patterns are much less intrusive. So if you've got linear patterns, checks, lines, etc., possibly double check those and check them with users before you install a lot, because they can cause visual disturbance, moire effect and everything. The biophilic patterns tend to be much less likely to do that. So that's biophilic coming from nature, so natural forms. And there are fixtures and fittings. There's some repeat here with the acoustic section, but with the low noise hand dryers particularly, they were particularly problematic. A lot of people mentioned those in the Helen Hamlin and since. But positioning of items are symmetrical. Some people have poor approximation, so they can't judge distances very well, so they walk into things. So having things in quite orderly fashion is really helpful. As this furniture was just nicely rounded corners, use of natural materials, I've said before, for biophilic, and familiarity and ease of operation. And then section 14 is actually quite a big one, particularly on this area, quiet and restorative spaces. So it's about, with all your environments, trying to make sure there are different types of zones and adjustabilities that you can offer. So giving people back some control, but also somewhere they can go if all goes wrong and it's just too much. So we cover quiet rooms quite extensively. Sensory rooms are ones that stimulate, so we have not covered those specifically in this standard. So this is my colleague Toa. She was a student at the time when I was doing the PAS at UCL and has since joined Bureau Happold. She did a really excellent piece of work on autism and quiet rooms, which really fed into the PAS and influenced much of the guidance that we put in there. So identifying quiet room, and usually they're small rooms. So people said to me, oh, I've got really great sized quiet room. It'll take 20 people. Well, actually, realistically, 20 people aren't going to huddle together. So let's go in here because we're having sensory overload. It's much more likely someone's going to want a room for 1 or 2 people, perhaps with a colleague or friend to support them. So small areas quite often is better. I think they should always be readily available, or some of them should be, i.e. not bookable out for something else. You can have flexibility for temporary quiet spaces. So, you know, someone could commandeer maybe a meeting room that wasn't booked. But there's much more emphasis in this section on acoustics, lighting, and the colours you use, features, planting, and so on. And then just to reiterate that our neuro profile can be a significant factor for our mental well-being. So these quiet restorative spaces really, really do help. And bringing in the biophilic anywhere in the building, including this space, it is a must, really. And then moving on to Annex A, then this management and maintenance section, we're saying that neurodiversity should be considered in policies, procedures, communications, embed it in your procurement. It's going to apply differently based on your circumstances and users. I can't say a one size fits all on this. You're going to have to look at what users you've got and the nuances of what's happening in your building. But I think greater attention is needed for this when you think people will be unfamiliar with it. So if you've got a lot of visitors coming in, and busy places are naturally going to be much more complex. So if you're running a major transport, actually more quiet rooms than perhaps others. And then there's ability keep arrangements and very different for someone who experiences that hypersensitivity, because once the alarm and the lighting's flashing and all of that's going on, it's people bustling around trying to get out. You can understand that you might need a peep or someone with that trait. Concentration and engagement with use is important, and there's some facilities management stuff here. You know, about the rounded corners, how you manage the quiet rooms, can you provide sensory mapping, how well should your staff be trained, how can you reduce clutter, what about, you know, catering, food storage, cooking smells. So if you've got strong cooking smells, how are you going to prevent that? And then the implications for the guests and peeps, of course. So in summary, what we're trying to do with this guidance is to provide an environment that's got some clarity. It gives people some choice and control. Now that choice and control might be, I'm going to go and sit in another zone, or it might be, I can adjust the temperature or the lighting or something if I go to this particular space. And then a calm space to escape to when it's too much. Those are our 3 C's, around which everything else is pinned. In terms of application, it's not prescriptive, it's not mandatory, it's full of considerations about choice and variety. We are neurologically diverse, and it's going to be available as it is, free to download with 2-year shelf life, I believe, now. And the BSI is going to establish and trial some feedback. It should get embedded in a BSI or possibly an ISO over time. And that's hopefully going to be supported by a growing number of case studies. So if you've got examples of where you've applied this, BSI would be very pleased to hear from you. There is a bibliography in there, but I just wanted to say this is a very first step in a long journey, hugely informed by human experience and stories and amazing experts. So I'm really grateful, and I know BSI really grateful to all those people who gave their time so freely. behaviour is. So we don't operate in isolation from our environment in any way. So this is something that kind of really has to be looked at. Do 30 seconds on this, so it's okay. I've got this ambassador role for the built environment. It is voluntary.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but can you
Okay.
perhaps close your camera, because the bandwidth, it seems to be playing up a little bit.
Dropping. Okay. Let's see if I can do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Disability and Access Ambassador for the Built Environment is as I say, a voluntary role. I've lost the ability. Oh, no, it's typing. Right. And I want to use this role to promote access and inclusion. So I'm happy to hear from anybody who feels there are things to take up. But at the moment, I'm looking at mental health and neurodiversity, eco-ableism with the sustainability and how that can impact on people. I've got the connectivity with the Minister for Disabled People and other representatives who are from the other ambassadors at other types of environment. So that does give us a stronger voice collectively. So if you think of anything, please let me know. And I'll finish there and hand back to Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Their video is coming back up. Thank you very much, Jean. You have gone through so much, and thankfully I've got some thoughts about how to proceed, because there's so much that we would want to touch upon. I really would like to bring Chris into the conversation now, and we've also started to receiving some messages from the audience, so we will start engaging with those as well. But Chris, obviously you have shared that you are neurodivergent. Can you tell us a little bit about your own journey about being neurodivergent and how that has impacted you in the workplace, please?
It's impacted me greatly, really, and I've more understood it better in sort of the last 15, 20 years. But I sort of came into FM and absolutely fell in love with the patterns and the repetition of FM, doing weekly tasks, monthly, quarterly, measuring KPIs and looking for patterns and things. And that's why I sort of fell in love with FM, and that's why I was so successful at it, is because you find something you really enjoy, and then you run with it. But I was struggling against a lot of things, and what Jean was talking about the built environment, about changing offices and stuff. It's absolutely great to hear, and hopefully now we can all get together and start improving the office environment and the built environment for people to flourish.
Thank you, Chris. Now you've mentioned that you feel open about this, to talk about this now and share your own experiences. Has this always been like this?
No, not at all. I masked quite a lot and hid my my autism because I wasn't really trusting about opening up, and but more and more, if you open up and actually talk to people, you can you find trust in companies, and you find trust in people, and actually you can put in changes for your day-to-day that help you. So instead of I would mask and get through a week and get through a really, really busy, hard week, and it would take me the whole weekend, possibly a Monday as well, to recover from a really busy week, where everyone else in my teams and stuff were all raring to go on a Monday morning. I would be still recovering from last week. So opening up about things like that there and talking more, helps loads.
Thank you. Jean, shall we try and see if your camera is working again, and if it's affecting the sound quality? Because now that we're in the discussion, it would be nice to see people's faces. Just going to one of the questions actually from the audience, Stella asked us about how a number of staff are impacted via the routine fire alarm testing. Do you have any recommendations to maintain legal compliance without distressing staff?
Obviously, you have to test. and you have to test it you at the appropriate frequency. So I would say letting staff know what that routine time is, and if it's going to vary, they should be able to self-manage that. They can set prompts on their own mobile phone to allow them to then put on noise cancelling headphones or leave the office temporarily, find another area, find some other way of dealing with that. So I think people can quite often self-manage if you give them the information.
Yeah, I was going to say, I suffer from sensitivity around noise. I do like loud noise, I do like music, but when it's something that's high pitched or that I'm not expecting, it can really leave you in a right state. But I use flares, so flares earplugs, so they don't cancel out all noise, but they focus what you can hear. And if you're expecting it, you can, like Jean says, you can cope with that. I've worked in several different places over the years, and certainly in a chemical factory, you had like 10 different sirens that would go off, and they would be tested throughout the day all the time. But what we would do we would play the sounds, so I know which sound they are. We would start off just in an office, play the sounds, so I would get used to that. So when you hear it on a loudspeaker across a 10-mile site, you know what it is, and you don't panic straight away, and you know it's going to be tested. And then you know the different types, because in different environments, and our FM colleagues will be in all sorts of different environments, you have different sirens for different things. So I've worked on, oil refineries that have all sorts of different sirens. Again, you have to get used to that. You have to know what it's going to be, and then know when they're going to test, because as we know, we have to do compliance. We have to do these things. So it's all about experiencing it first. So it's like testing a fire alarm. As an FM, going to test a fire alarm can be, for someone like myself, that can be crazy, but actually doing it, so doing the test and knowing what's going to happen that week around that time each week, that makes you better with it then.
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to explore a little bit. The PAS has obviously been a response to the fact that there is increasing awareness around neurodivergency. Workplaces traditionally have been set up for neurotypical people. And actually, Chris, staying with you for a moment, how has your workplace helped you to be the best possible you for all of this time that you've been on your journey?
I think making little changes, helps a lot. I mean, so I'm not based at one workplace. I travel around all the time. But what I will do for that, and Jean touched on it on her presentation actually, was having visitors to an office, being able to go onto your website and see what the front door looks like, what you're going to walk into, what the wayfinding is going to be in that building. Because I'm very similar to Jean. I'll get lost. If those signs are not very clear to me, or even if they are right in front of me, but they're in a different, a funky text, I won't be able to read that, and I'll just get lost in a building. So, having very clear signs and people been able to research before they go to a place to see, like I say, what's the front door look like? What's the access issues? Where am I actually going when I get into there? It was interesting actually. We went to a conference in Birmingham a couple of months ago that had a bright pink carpet, and I'd never actually noticed today before about this, but it was very, very bright pink and very luminous. And I tripped up about 12 times just in the morning because I couldn't work out where the floor was when I was walking. And it was interesting when Jean was talking about that, about the flooring. I'd never even thought about that before, but I do get disorientated about that. So in my own workplace, I have noise cancelling earphones. So when I'm traveling, I will use them, because they will help me get from A to B, especially in really busy train stations, that sort of stuff. And then, it's about times of meetings and, because I like to travel earlier in the morning when it's less busy. We have been, during COVID, travel was a breeze really on trains and stuff, but we're now back up to proper levels again. So we're having to redesign my working week to make sure I can travel when it's not as busy, get to meetings, with plenty of time so I can decompress and be ready for that.
Thank you. I'm going through the questions from the audience, and Gail asked something that I've been wanting to ask you as well, about what is specific to your employer. What have they done to assist you with your working environment? Is there anything specific?
I think really it's just given me the opportunity to work the way I would like to, hybridly. They provide me with noise cancelling earphones, but also they provide me with a mentor and someone to talk to. And I think that's one of the most important things here, is when we're talking to employees or when we're talking to people about how we can help, it's having that safe person to talk to, and then having maybe a committee. So I sit on the Pareto Inclusion Committee, and I openly talk about what my struggles are, and then all our employees then have opened up because I'm talking about it, and we've come across, like Jean said earlier on, most things we try to touch each base, but everybody's slightly different. Everyone has different sensitives. You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everybody sees the world differently. So it's about having a good network in your employee groups that you can talk to. And whether that be a group of people or one person, I've been really lucky to have a really good mentor, and to help me along in my career. But yeah, I would say that's the best thing for me at the minute. In Pareto, we have a really good inclusion committee. We have a really good network of people that we can all talk to, and I have an excellent mentor.
Brilliant. Jean, wanting to come to you, there was another question here querying whether all of this could it not be addressed through the DSC workplace assessment? How do you design and consider everyone? What supports one might be detrimental to another one? I think you might be well placed to answer that one, given your experience with a variety of employers.
To kind of provide mainstream generic environments, which could be a museum, could be a workplace, could be a hospital, that have the flexibility to accommodate all needs. Now, the workplace assessment and adjustment is really around addressing specific needs that the environment wouldn't normally meet. And I think when you start looking at neurodiversity, it becomes tricky, because I think you need to start by trying to look at the environment as a whole and giving that flexibility. And if it's still not right, then you would look at specific needs, like the noise cancelling headphones is obviously a very good assistive aid for a lot of people that are hypersensitive to noise. So you could do a workplace assessment for someone with a neurodivergent condition. I think that would be a good thing to do, but hopefully a general, very generic look at your whole environment and looking at what you could do there for everybody would have to happen as well. Otherwise, you're kind of siloing people and saying, well, you're only going to be in this zone and we're going to do it all in this space, rather than you should be able to move anywhere, ideally. I mean, there are exceptions to that, of course, but yeah. Does that answer the question? I can't see it on the...
It's in our Q&A box at the bottom. We might come back to that, but I wanted to touch on the fact that, what's already been alluded to, what works for one person might not necessarily work for another. Some of the experiences people are going through may be a little bit more of a fluid stage as well. It might be only for a period in their life. So neurodiversity in itself covers huge grounds. It's vast. Is there much overlap with other areas that are receiving a little bit more attention and awareness and increasing understanding at the moment?
That one for me, Sophie.
I'm thinking more of things like, recently there's been much greater understanding about menopause and what the impact is on people in work, and menopause wouldn't necessarily be...
It's interesting, yeah. So we started looking at the menopause study, which is 30416, which came out a couple of weeks ago. And that's looking at menstrual and menopausal health. And there are key differences in how those times of your life might be experienced by people with neurodivergent traits, which I think was very interesting. But I think, at the end of the day, we have to look at this intersectionality. Everything's connected. So you can be neurodivergent, but also have a disability, a physical disability or other disability as well. So we have to look at the whole and try and make everything as flexible as we can. But what the menopause and menstrual health standard is saying is, look, there are particular times in your life when your neurodivergent trait might change. So you could be self-managing your ADHD, for example, but then you get to menopause, the perimenopause, and suddenly it's worse and you're not self-managing the same, and managers need to understand that. And FM may need to understand that as well, that it might suddenly change. It's no good saying, well, but you've always had ADHD and we've always done it okay so far, why is it suddenly an issue? People change, and this can really affect how their symptoms change.
Thank you. Thank you. I was also quite taken with your query earlier on about LED, because when I do a lot of work on LED, of course, at the moment, and all about we must get to sustainability. Well, we must get to net zero. So very often one of the measures that people are starting to take is at the very top of the easy to take off list is LED. Where do you see some of those linkages with neurodiversity and sustainability?
Well, I don't want to stop people switching to LED. We need to kind of save the planet, but not at the expense of the people. And the issue is one of compatibility, so it's appropriate design. So they weren't being designed, they were just being thrown in to hospital environments, actually, in this case. And we had people, very articulate, working people who happened to have autism, had the hypersensitivity, becoming non-verbal within a matter of minutes in one of these new environments, which is not acceptable. And there are people with neurodivergent traits occupying hospital beds and then being made worse by the environment and not able to recover and flourish and leave the hospital. And some people have been in hospital for a long time. Really, really important. So there's a paper on that, and I can send you that so that it can be available to everyone. It's freely downloadable as well. But I think there are some talks with CIBSE about how we could get that into some sort of code later, hopefully. The issue was that when you are hypersensitive, you sometimes can see a flicker that until recently we didn't realize humans could see. So when you're designing systems, you're thinking, oh, this is okay, this doesn't flicker. And actually, there will be either see their flicker or their brain knows there's a flicker. So sometimes you don't know you're seeing it, but you're just getting headaches and other symptoms. So it's just one of several areas that is shooting off from the PAS and is now being looked at. And I hope that the PAS will be a catalyst to lots of research like this, because we really need it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Jean. And I think especially important because it's at a time where people are doing a lot of changes from a sustainability perspective. So that's something to really bear in mind when you go out to purchase an awful lot of LEDs. Quickly want to touch upon expectations, because increasing awareness and generations of changing approaches towards neurodiversity is really changing the way we approach all of this. What do we see from the different generations around differing expectations, and especially bearing in mind that FM has got a talent gap?
Yeah, I think I've certainly noticed, for when I, earlier in my career, I wouldn't ask for a change. I would just cope with it myself. And I think that's, the sort of generation part now, if we're getting younger people coming into FM and they actually are expecting these changes to already be in the workplace. They're expecting these to be there, not to ask for them or not to sit down and talk to a line manager about doing reasonable changes. They're expecting this to be there. Where, I've spent an awful lot of time having to get over barriers and worrying about actually talking and asking about changes. But yeah, certainly I'm definitely saying, and just talking about the LEDs there, I've seen some really good examples in offices where they've refitted, and you have each user, each section has an app that can change the lights for them, and they can put 5-10 different modes on there. Although I have seen that work, and I've seen it work really well. I've also seen it work when you're walking into a place and you think, well, this is crazy. There's different lights all the way along the road here, and everyone's happy in their little bubble. But me walking past that, it makes me go all over the place. But like Jean was saying about seeing a flicker, I can see a flicker, but I can also hear aircon. Another good thing in FM, I can tell you if your aircon's going to go down in a couple of weeks' time because I can hear it asking for more energy.
That's brilliant, Chris. People are going to start asking for your preventative maintenance plans. Let's come around to the office. Now, there are so many questions I still have for you, but I think it's important that we circle a little bit back to some of the expectations and the whole labeling thing. And Jean, one of the first slides you almost talked about is that not everyone has got a formal diagnosis. A lot of people don't have formal diagnoses. You also mentioned that the PAS avoids labels. And I would say that also you mentioned that many of the measures will help everyone. And actually, Chris, you mentioned that as well. Some of the things that have been discussed have a positive impact on everyone. And I think it kind of relates back to the questions around DSE. Should we really just look at this PAS as an opportunity to really optimize the workplace for everyone? And I don't want that, not looking for a yes/no response, but where is that balance with reasonable adjustment? Whether should we just be talking about productivity adjustments? Thoughts, Jean, please.
I think productivity adjustment is a really lovely term, and it's much more meaningful and is more likely to motivate an employer or organisation to do it because they realise it's going to allow their staff to flourish. The reasonable adjustment obviously is legally defined under the Equality Act, and it could be one and the same, but I really like the term productivity adjustment because I think says what it truly is. It's allowing someone to perform well.
And ultimately, that's what we want to do. Enable everyone to do their best possible work wherever they're working from. I'm very mindful of time, and I'm sorry we don't quite get to touch on everything that we discussed in the pre-discussion. But before we go away, I've got quick 2 closing questions, really. One, what top tip would you give to colleagues to set them on their journey? And 2, what would you like everyone to do after leaving this webinar?
I think really, I heard a phrase a couple of weeks ago, the physical office space is part of a wider employment ecosystem. And I think, that's really good advice for employers and line managers of, yes, we could get the physical space as much as we can, right? But it's part of a bigger ecosystem. It's about looking after your people, and like we just touched on there, getting the formal diagnosis could take up to 4 years. So actually that person that could have rocketed up in your company might have gone by the time you make any adjustments. So let's just get it right for people, and let's just think about people, and getting the environment right and getting the social environment right for people.
Okay, thank you very much for those profound thoughts. Jean?
I think we need to stop putting people in boxes and labeling them and just kind of try and do what's right for everyone. There is the intersectionality as well, it always comes into play. So I'm hoping that people go away from this thinking more broadly about neurodiversity and all the other things that go on in people's lives and how they interject with one another, and just make great workplaces for people as much as they can. And if they get it wrong, just ask, talk to people and consult with users all the time.
Thank you. We've covered so much on this webinar, and I feel like there is so much more to cover, so we might be back at some point for part 2. Hopefully colleagues in the audience will walk away with some inspiration about how to create more inclusive workplaces for all colleagues, and I think some people are definitely walking away with the LED tips, and that might hopefully avoid a costly mistake. Really, Jean, Chris, thank you so much for your time and your lived experience and insights. You have so much to share. To listeners, a recording will be available for anyone who wants to listen again and share with a friend. I do believe we might have some CPD points, so if the next few slides could demonstrate that. The PAS is also available from the website, the BSI website, freely available, as Jean reminded us, and our own IWFM access guidance can be found on our website, and we will be updating that. As Jean mentioned, we and the EDI focus group have also fed into the REBA inclusive design overlay on the plan of work, and that leaves me 1 minute late to thank everyone again for joining us. I wish you a good afternoon, and we'll be back next week to talk about workplace productivity in the post-pandemic world. Have a good week all. Until next time. Bye.